Galapagos by Kurt Vonnegut. Part 4, Book 1, Chapters 23 through 31. Read by Ron Gabaldon. 23. So, without any idea that he was going to become the sire of all humankind, I got into the head of Captain Adolf von Kleist as he rode in a taxicab from Guyaquil International Airport to the Bahia de Darwin. I did not know that humanity was about to be diminished to a tiny point by luck, and then, again by luck, to be permitted to expand again. I believed that the chaos involving billions of big-brained people thrashing around every which way and reproducing would go on and on. It did not seem likely that an individual could be significant in such an unplanned uproar. My choosing the captain's head for a vehicle, then, was the equivalent of putting a coin in a slot machine in an enormous gambling casino and hitting a jackpot right away. It was his uniform which attracted me as much as anything. He was wearing the white and gold uniform of a reserve admiral. I myself had been a private, and so was curious to know what the world looked like to a person of very high military rank and social standing. And I was mystified to find his big brain thinking about meteorites. That was often my experience back then. I would get into the head of somebody in what to me was a particularly interesting situation, and discover that the person's big brain was thinking about things which had nothing to do with the problem right at hand. Here was the thing about the captain and meteorites. He had paid little attention to most of his instructors at the United States Naval Academy and had graduated at the very bottom of his class. He, in fact, would have been expelled for cheating in an examination on celestial navigation if his parents hadn't interceded through diplomatic channels. But he had been impressed by one lecture on the subject of meteorites. The instructor said that showers of great boulders from outer space had been quite common over the eons, and their impacts had been so terrific, possibly, as to have caused the extinction of many life forms, including the dinosaurs. He said that human beings had every reason to expect more such planet smashers at any time, and should devise apparatus for distinguishing between enemy missiles and meteorites. Otherwise, utterly meaningless wrath from outer space could trigger World War III. And this apocalyptic warning so suited the wiring of the captain's brain, even before his father came down with Huntington's chorea, that he would ever after believe that that was indeed the most likely way in which humanity would be exterminated, by meteorites. To the captain, it was such a much more honorable and poetic and even beautiful way for humanity to die than World War III would be. When I got to know his big brain better, I understood that there was a certain logic to his thinking about meteorites while he was looking out at Guyaquil with its hungry crowds under martial law. Even without the glamour of a meteorite shower, the world would be ending for the people of Guyaquil. In a sense, too, this man had already been hit by a meteorite, by the murder of his mother by his father. And his feeling that life was a meaningless nightmare with nobody watching or caring what was going on was actually quite familiar to me. That was how I felt after I shot a grandmother in Vietnam. She was as toothless and bent over as Mary Hepburn would be at the end of her life. I shot her because she had just killed my best friend and my worst enemy in my platoon with a single hand grenade. This episode made me sorry to be alive. Made me envy stones. I would rather have been a stone at the service of the natural order. The captain went straight from the airport to his ship without stopping off at the hotel to see his brother. He had been drinking champagne during the long flight from New York City, and so had a splitting headache. And when we got aboard the Bahia de Darwin, it was obvious to me that his function as captain, like his functions as a reserve admiral, were purely ceremonial. Others would be doing the navigating and engineering and maintaining crew discipline and so on, while he socialized with the distinguished passengers. He knew very little about the operation of the ship, nor did he feel he needed to know much about it. His familiarity with the Galapagos Islands was likewise sketchy. He had made ceremonial visits as an admiral to the naval base on the island of Baltra and the Darwin Research Station on Santa Cruz, again as essentially a passenger on board a ship of which he was nominally the commander. But all the rest of the islands were terra incognita to him. He would have been a more instructive guide on the ski slopes of Switzerland, say, or on the carpets of the casino at Monte Carlo, or to the stables serving at Palm Beach polo fields. But again, what did it matter? On the nature cruise of the century, there would be guides and lecturers trained at the Darwin Research Station and holding graduate degrees in the natural sciences. The captain intended to listen to them carefully and learn about the islands right along with the rest of the passengers. Riding in the captain's skull, I had hoped to find out what it was like to be a supreme commander. I found out instead what it was like to be a social butterfly. We were received with all possible signs of military respect when we came up the gangplank, but once aboard, no officers or crewmen asked us for instructions about anything as they made the final preparations for the arrival of Mrs. Onassis and the rest of them. So, as far as the captain knew, the ship was still going to sail the next day. He had not been told otherwise. Since he had been back in Ecuador for only an hour and still had a bellyful of good New York food and a champagne headache, it had yet to dawn on him what awful trouble he and his ship were in. There is another human defect which the law of natural selection has yet to remedy. When people of today have full bellies, they are exactly like their ancestors of 1,000,000 years ago, very slow to acknowledge any awful troubles they may be in. Then is when they forget to keep a sharp lookout for sharks and whales. This was a particularly tragic flaw 1,000,000 years ago, since the people who were best informed about the state of the planet, like Andrew McIntosh, for example, and rich and powerful enough to slow down all the waste and destruction going on, were by definition well-fed. So everything was just fine as far as they were concerned. For all the computers and measuring instruments and news gatherers and evaluators and memory banks and libraries and experts on this and that at their disposal, their deaf and blind bellies remained the final judges of how urgent this or that problem, such as the destruction of North America's and Europe's forests by acid rain, say, might really be. And here was the sort of advice a full belly gave and still gives, and which the captain's full belly gave him when the first mate of the Bahia de Darwin, Hernando Cruz, told him that none of the guides had shown up or been heard from, and that a third of the crewmen had deserted so far, feeling that they had better look after their families. Be patient, smile, be confident. Everything will turn out for the best somehow. 24. Mary Hepburn had seen and appreciated the captain's comical performance on The Tonight Show, and then another one on Good Morning America. To that extent, she felt she already knew him some before her big brain made her come to Guyaquil. He was on The Tonight Show 2 weeks after Roy died, and he was the first person to make her laugh out loud after that sad event. There she was, in the living room of her little house, with the houses on all sides of her empty and for sale, and heard herself laugh out loud about the ridiculous Ecuadorian submarine fleet, whose tradition was to go underwater and never come up again. She supposed then that von Kleist was a lot like Roy in loving nature and machinery. Otherwise, why would he have been chosen to be the captain of the Bahia de Darwin? Now, her big brain had her say out loud to the captain's image on the cathode ray tube, to the considerable embarrassment of her soul, although there was no one to hear her, "Would you by any chance like to marry me?" It would turn out that she knew at least a little bit more about machinery than he did, just from living with Roy. After Roy died and the lawnmower wouldn't start, for example, she was able to change the spark plug and get it going, something the captain could never have done. And she knew a whole lot more about the islands. It was Mary who correctly identified the island on which they would be marooned. The captain, grasping for shreds of self-respect and authority after his big brain made such a mess of things, declared the island to be Rabida, which it surely wasn't, and which, in any case, he had never seen. And what allowed Mary to recognize Santa Rosalia were the dominant sorts of finches there. These drab little birds, incidentally, so uninteresting to most tourists and to Mary's students, had been as exciting to young Charles Darwin as the great land tortoises, or the boobies, or marine iguanas, or any other creatures there. The thing was, the finches looked very much alike, but they were in fact divided into 13 different species, each species with its own peculiar diet and method for getting food. None had close relatives on the mainland of South America or anywhere. Their ancestors might, too, have arrived on Noah's Ark or a natural raft, since it was wholly out of character for a finch to set out on a flight of 1,000 kilometers over open ocean. There were no woodpeckers on the islands, but there was a finch who ate what woodpeckers would have eaten. It couldn't peck wood, so it took a twig or a spine from a cactus in its blunt little beak, and used that to dig insects out of their hiding places. Another sort of finch was a bloodsucker, pecking at the long neck of an unheeding booby until it had raised little beads of blood. Then it sipped that perfect diet to its heart's content. This bird was called by human beings Geospiza difficilis. The principal nesting place of these queer finches, their Garden of Eden, was the island of Santa Rosalia. She would probably never have heard of that island, so removed from the rest of the archipelago, and so rarely visited by anyone, if it weren't for its swarms of Geospiza difficilis. And she surely wouldn't have lectured so much about it if the bloodsuckers hadn't been the only finches she could make her students give much of a damn about. Great teacher that she was, she would go along with her students by describing the birds as ideal pets for Count Dracula. This entirely fictitious count, she knew, was a far more significant person to most of her students than George Washington, for instance, who was merely the founder of their country. They were better informed about Dracula, too, so that Mary could expand her joke, admitting that he might not enjoy Geospiza difficilis as a pet after all, since he, whom she then called Homo transylvaniensis, slept all through the daytime, where Geospiza difficilis slept all through the night. So perhaps, she would decide with mock sadness, the best pet for Count Dracula remains a member of the family Desmodontidae, which is a scientific way of saying vampire bat. And then she would top that joke by saying, if you should find yourself on Santa Rosalia and you have killed a specimen of Geospiza difficilis, what must you do to make sure that it stays dead forever? Her answer was this: you must bury it at a crossroads, of course, with a little stake driven through its heart. What was so thought-provoking about all sorts of Galapagos finches to young Charles Darwin, though, was that they were behaving as best they could like a wide variety of much more specialized birds on the continents. He was still prepared to believe, if it turned out to make sense, that God Almighty had created all the creatures just as Darwin found them on his trip around the world. But his big brain had to wonder why the Creator, in the case of the Galapagos Islands, would have given every conceivable job for a small land bird to an often ill-adapted finch. What would have prevented the Creator, if he thought the islands should have a woodpecker-type bird, from creating a real woodpecker? If he thought a vampire was a good idea, why didn't he give the job to a vampire bat instead of a finch, for heaven's sake? A vampire finch? And Mary used to state the same intellectual problem to her students, concluding, "Your comments, please." When she went ashore for the first time on the Black Peak where the Bahia de Darwin had been run aground, Mary stumbled. She broke her fall in such a way as to abrade the knuckles on her right hand. It wasn't a painful event. She made the most cursory examination of her injuries. There were these scratches from which beads of blood arose. But then a finch, utterly fearless, lit on her finger. She was unsurprised, since she had heard many stories of finches landing on people's heads and hands and drinking cups or whatever. So she resolved to enjoy this welcome to the islands, and held her hand still, and spoke sweetly to the bird. "And which of the 13 sorts of finch are you?" she said. As though it understood her question, the bird now showed her what sort it was by sipping up the red beads on her knuckles. So she took another look around at the island, never imagining that she was going to spend the rest of her life there, providing thousands of meals for vampire finches. She said to the captain, for whom she had lost all respect, "You say this is Rabida Island?" "Yes," he said. "I'm quite sure of it." "Well, I hate to tell you this after all you've been through, but you're wrong again," she said. "This has to be Santa Rosalia." "How can you be so sure?" he said. And she said, "This little bird just told me so." 25. On the island of Manhattan, Bobby King turned out the light in his office atop the Chrysler Building and said goodnight to his secretary and went home. He will not appear in this tale again. Nothing more he did from that moment on until, many busy years later, he entered the Blue Tunnel into the afterlife, would have the slightest bearing on the future of the human race. In Guyaquil, at the same moment that Bobby King reached home, Zenji Hiraguchi was leaving his room at the Hotel El Dorado, angry with his pregnant wife. She had said unforgivable things about his motives in creating Gokubi and then Mandarax. He pressed the button for the elevator and snapped his fingers and breathed very shallowly. And then, out into the corridor came the person he least wanted to see, the cause of all his troubles as far as he was concerned, who was Andrew McIntosh. "Oh, there you are," said McIntosh. "I was just going to tell you that there was some sort of trouble with the telephones. As soon as they're fixed, I will have very good news for you." Zenji, whose genes live on today, was so jangled by his wife, and now by McIntosh, that he could not speak. So he punched out this message on the keys of Mandarax in Japanese and had Mandarax display the words to McIntosh on its little screen. "I do not wish to talk now. I am very upset. Please leave me alone." Like Bobby King, incidentally, McIntosh would have no further influence on the future of the human race. If his daughter had agreed 10 years later to be artificially inseminated on Santa Rosalia, it might have been a very different story. I think it's safe to say that he would have liked very much to participate in Mary Hepburn's experiments with the captain's sperm. If Selena had been more venturesome, everybody today might then have been descended as he was, from the stout-hearted Scottish warriors who had repelled invading Roman legions so long ago. What a missed opportunity! As Mandarax would have it, "For of all sad words of tongue or pen, the saddest are these, it might have been." John Greenleaf Whittier, 1807 to 1892. "What can I do to help?" said McIntosh. "I'll do anything, just name it." Zenji found that he couldn't even shake his head. The best he could do was to close his eyes tight, and then the elevator arrived, and Zenji thought the top of his head would blow off when McIntosh got into it with him. "Look," said McIntosh on the way down, "I'm your friend. You can tell me anything. If I'm what's bothering you, you can tell me to take a flying fuck at a rolling donut, and I'll be the first to sympathize. I make mistakes. I'm human." When they got down to the lobby, Zenji's big brain gave him the impractical, almost infantile advice that he should somehow run away from McIntosh, that he could beat this athletic American in a foot race. So right out the front door of the hotel he went, and onto the cordoned-off section of the Calle Diaz de Agosto, with McIntosh right beside him. The two of them were across the lobby and out into the sunset, so quickly that the unlucky von Kleist brother, Siegfried, behind the bar in the cocktail lounge, couldn't even shout a warning to them in time. Too late, he cried, "Please, please, I wouldn't go out there if I were you." And then he ran after them. Many events, which would have repercussions a million years later, were taking place in a small space on the planet in a very short time. While the unlucky von Kleist brother was running after McIntosh and Hiraguchi, The lucky one was taking a shower in his cabin just aft of the bridge of the Bahia de Darwin. He wasn't doing anything particularly important to the future of humankind, other than surviving, other than staying alive. But his first mate, whose name was Hernando Cruz, was about to take a radically influential action. Cruz was outside on the sun deck, gazing, as it happened, at the only other ship in sight, the Colombian freighter San Mateo, long anchored in the estuary. Cruz was a stocky, bald man about the captain's age, who had made 50 cruises out to the islands and back on other ships. He had been part of the skeleton crew which had brought the Bahia de Darwin from Malmo. He had supervised her outfitting in Guyaquil, while the nominal captain had made a publicity tour of the United States. This man had stocked his big brain with a perfect understanding of every part of the ship, from the mighty diesels below to the ice maker behind the bar in the main saloon. He, moreover, knew the personal strengths and weaknesses of every crewman and had earned his respect. This was the real captain, who would really run the ship, while Adolf von Kleist, potching around in the shower now and singing, would charm the passengers at mealtimes and dance with each and every one of the ladies at night. Cruz was least concerned with what he happened to be looking at, the San Mateo and the great raft of vegetable matter which had accumulated around her anchor line. That rusty little ship had become such a permanent fixture that it might as well have been a lifeless rock out there. But now he saw that a small tanker had come alongside the San Mateo and was nursing it as a whale might have nursed a calf. It was excreting diesel fuel through a flexible tube. That would be mother's milk to the engine of the San Mateo. What had happened was that the San Mateo's owners had received a large number of United States dollars in exchange for Colombian cocaine and smuggled those dollars into Ecuador, where they were traded not only for diesel fuel, but for the most precious commodity of all, which was food, which was fuel for human beings. So there was still a certain amount of international commerce going on. Cruz could not divine the details of the corruption which had made the fueling and provisioning of the San Mateo possible, but he surely meditated on corruption in general. To wit, anybody who had liquid wealth, whether he deserved it or not, could have anything he wanted. The captain in the shower was such a person, and Cruz was not. The painstakingly accumulated lifetime savings of Cruz, all in sucres, had turned to trash. He envied the elation the San Mateo's crewmen were feeling now that they were going home. Since rising at dawn, Cruz himself had been thinking seriously about going home. He had a pregnant wife and 11 children in a nice house out by the airport, and they were scared. They certainly needed him, and yet, until now, abandoning a ship to which he was duty-bound, no matter for what reason, had seemed to him a form of suicide, an obliteration of all that was admirable in his character and reputation. But now he decided to walk off the Bahia de Darwin anyway. He patted the rail around the sun deck, and he spoke this softly in Spanish. "Good luck, my Swedish princess. I shall dream of you." His case was very much like that of Jesus Ortiz, who had disconnected the El Dorado's telephones. His big brain had concealed from his soul until the last possible moment its conclusion that it was now time for him to act antisocially. That left Adolf von Kleist completely in charge, although he didn't know shit from Shinola about navigation, the Galapagos Islands, or the operation and maintenance of a ship that size. The combination of the captain's incompetence and the decision of Hernando Cruz to go to the aid of his own flesh and blood, although the stuff of low comedy at the time, had turned out to be of incalculable value to present-day humankind. So much for comedy, so much for supposedly serious stuff. If the nature cruise of the century had come off as planned, the division of duties between the captain and his first mate would have been typical of the management of so many organizations a million years ago, with the nominal leader specializing in sociable balderdash, and with the supposed second-in-command burdened with the responsibility of understanding how things really worked and what was really going on. The best-run nations commonly had such symbiotic pairings at the top. And when I think about the suicidal mistakes nations used to make in olden times, I see that these polities were trying to get along with just an Adolf von Kleist at the top, without a Hernando Cruz. Too late, the surviving inhabitants of such a nation would crawl from ruins of their own creation and realize that throughout all their self-imposed agony, there had been absolutely nobody at the top who had understood how things really worked, what it was all about, what was really going on. 26. The lucky von Kleist brother, the common sire of everybody alive today, was tall and thin, and had a beak like an eagle's. He had a great head of curly hair, which had once been golden, which was now white. He had been put in command of the Bahia de Darwin, with the understanding that his first mate would do all the serious thinking, for the same reason Siegfried had been put in charge of the hotel. His uncles in Quito had wanted a close relative to watch over their famous guests and valuable property. The captain and his brother had beautiful homes in the chilly mists above Quito, which they would never see again. They had also inherited considerable wealth from their murdered mother and both sets of grandparents. Almost none of it was in worthless sucres. Almost all of it was managed by the Chase Manhattan Bank in New York City, which had caused it to be represented by US dollars and Japanese yen. Dancing there in the shower stall, the captain did not think he had much to worry about, as troubled as things seemed to be in Guyaquil. No matter what happened, Hernando Cruz would know what to do. His big brain came up with what he thought might be a good idea to pass on to Cruz after he had dried himself off. If it looked like the crew was about to desert, he thought, Cruz could remind them that the Bahia de Darwin was technically a ship of war, which meant that deserters would be subject to strict punishment under regulations of the Navy. This was bad law, but he was right that the ship on paper was a part of the Ecuadorian Navy. The captain himself, in his role as admiral, had welcomed her to that fighting force when she arrived from Malmo during the summer. Her decks had yet to be carpeted, and the bare steel was dotted here and there with plugged holes which could accept the mounts for machine guns and rocket launchers and racks of depth charges and so on, should war ever come. She would then become an armored troop carrier, with, as the captain had said on The Tonight Show, 10 bottles of Dom Perignon and Van Bidet for every 100 enlisted men. The captain had some other ideas in the shower, but they had all come from Hernando Cruz. For instance, if the cruise was canceled, which seemed almost a certainty, then Cruz and a few men would anchor the ship out on the marsh somewhere, away from looters. Cruz could think of no reason for the captain to come along on a trip like that. If all hell broke loose, and there seemed to be no safe place for the ship anywhere near the city, then Cruz planned to take her out to the naval base on the Galapagos island of Baltra. Again, Cruz hadn't been able to think of a reason for the captain to come along. Or, if the celebrities from New York City were still, incredibly, going to arrive the next morning, then it would be vital that the captain be aboard to greet and reassure them. While waiting for them, Cruz would anchor the Bahia de Darwin offshore, like the Colombian freighter San Mateo. He would bring the ship back to the wharf only when the celebrities were right there ready to board. He would get them out to the safety of the open ocean as quickly as possible, and then, depending on the news, he might actually take them on the promised tour of the islands. More likely, though, he would deliver them to some safer port than Guyaquil. But surely no port in Peru or Chile or Colombia, which was to say the entire coast of South America. The citizens of all those countries were at least as desperate as those of Ecuador. Panama was a possibility. If necessary, Hernando Cruz intended to take the celebrities all the way to San Diego. There was certainly more than enough food and fuel and water on the ship for a trip that long, and the celebrities could telephone their friends and relatives en route, telling them that no matter how bad the news from the rest of the world might be, they were living high on the hog as usual. One emergency plan the captain didn't consider there in the shower was that he himself take full charge of the ship with only Mary Hepburn to help him, and that he run it aground on Santa Rosalia, which would become the cradle of all humankind. Here is a quotation well known to Mandarax. "A little neglect may breed great mischief. For want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the rider was lost." Benjamin Franklin, 1706 to 1790. Yes, and a little neglect can breed good news just as easily. For want of Hernando Cruz aboard the Bahia de Darwin, humanity was saved. Cruz would have never run the ship aground on Santa Rosalia. And now he was driving away from the waterfront in his Cadillac Eldorado, its trunk packed solid with delicacies intended for the nature cruise of the century. He had stolen all that food for his family at dawn that day, long before the troops and the hungry mob arrived. His vehicle, which he had bought with graft from the outfitting and provisioning of the Bahia de Darwin, had the same name as the hotel, the same name as the legendary city of great riches and opportunity, which his Spanish ancestors had sought but never found. His ancestors used to torture Indians to make them tell where El Dorado was. It is hard to imagine anybody's torturing anybody nowadays. How could you even capture somebody you wanted to torture with just your flippers and your mouth? How could you even stage a manhunt now that people can swim so fast and stay underwater for so long? The person you were after would not only look pretty much like everybody else, but could also be hiding out at any depth practically anywhere. Hernando Cruz had done his bit for humanity. The Peruvian Air Force would do its bit as well, but not until 6 o'clock that evening, after Andrew McIntosh and Zenji Hiraguchi were dead, at which time Peru would declare war on Ecuador. Peru had been bankrupt for 14 days longer than Ecuador, so that hunger was that much more advanced there. Ground soldiers were going home and taking their weapons with them. Only the small Peruvian Air Force was still reliable, and the military junta was keeping it that way by giving its members the best of whatever food was still around. One thing which made the Air Force such a high morale unit was that its equipment, bought on credit and delivered before the bankruptcy, was so up to date. It had 8 new French fighter bombers, and each of these planes, moreover, was equipped with an American air-to-ground missile with a Japanese brain, which could home in on radar signals or on heat from an engine, depending on instructions from the pilot. The pilot was in turn being instructed by computers on the ground and in his cockpit. The warhead of each missile carried a new Israeli explosive, which was capable of creating 1/5 as much devastation as the atomic bomb the United States dropped on the mother of Hisako Hiraguchi during World War II. This new explosive was regarded as a great boon to big-brained military scientists. As long as they killed people with conventional rather than nuclear weapons, they were praised as humanitarian statesmen. As long as they did not use nuclear weapons, it appeared, nobody was going to give the right name to all the killing that had been going on since the end of the Second World War, which was surely World War III. The Peruvian junta gave this as its official reason for going to war, that the Galapagos Islands were rightfully Peru's, and that Peru was going to get them back again. Nobody today is nearly smart enough to make the sorts of weapons even the poorest nations had a million years ago. Yes, and they were being used all the time. During my lifetime, there wasn't a day when somewhere on the planet there weren't at least 3 wars going on. And the law of natural selection was powerless to respond to such new technologies. No female of any species, unless maybe she was a rhinoceros, could expect to give birth to a baby who was fireproof, bomb-proof, or bulletproof. The best that the law of natural selection could come up with in my time was somebody who wasn't afraid of anything, even though there was so much to fear. I knew a few people like that in Vietnam, to the extent that such people were knowable. And such a person was Andrew McIntosh. 27. Selina McIntosh would never know for certain that her father was dead until she was reunited with him at the far end of the Blue Tunnel into the afterlife. All she could be sure of was that he had departed her room at the El Dorado and exchanged some words with Zenji Hiraguchi out in the corridor. Then the two went down together in the elevator. After that, she would never again receive news about either one of them. Here is the story on her blindness, by the way. She had retinitis pigmentosa, caused by a defective gene inherited on the female side. She had got it from her mother, who could see perfectly well, and who had concealed from her husband the certainty that this was a gene she carried. This was another disease with which Mandarax was familiar, since it was one of the top 1,000 serious diseases of Homo sapiens. Mandarax, when asked about it by Mary on Santa Rosalia, would pronounce Selina's case a severe one, since she was blind at birth. It was more usual for retinitis pigmentosa, said Mandarax, son of Gokubi, to let its hosts and hostesses see the world clearly for as long as 30 years sometimes. Mandarax confirmed, too, what Selina herself had told Mary, that if she had a baby, there was a 50-50 chance that it would be blind. And if that baby was a female, whether it went blind or not, and that baby grew up and reproduced, there would be a 50-50 chance that its child would be blind. It is amazing that two such relatively rare hereditary defects, retinitis pigmentosa and Huntington's chorea, should have been causes for worry to the first human settlers of Santa Rosalia, since the settlers numbered only 10. As I have already said, the captain luckily turned out to be not a carrier. Selina was surely a carrier. If she had reproduced, though, I think humankind would still be free of retinitis pigmentosa now, thanks to the law of natural selection, and sharks and killer whales. Here is how her father and Zenji Hiraguchi died, incidentally, while she and her dog Kazak listened to the noise of the crowd outside. They were shot in their heads from behind, so they never knew what hit them. And the soldier who shot them is another person who should be credited with having done a little something, whose effects are still visible after 1,000,000 years. I am not talking about the shootings. I am talking about his breaking into the back door of a shuttered souvenir shop which faced the El Dorado. If he had not burglarized that shop, there would almost certainly be no human beings on the face of the earth today. I mean it. Everybody alive today should thank God that this soldier was insane. His name was Private Geraldo Delgado, and he had deserted his unit, taking his first aid kit and canteen and trench knife, automatic assault rifle and 2 grenades and several clips of ammunition and so on with him. He was only 18 years old and was a paranoid schizophrenic. He should never have been issued live ammunition. His big brain was telling him all sorts of things that were not true, that he was the greatest dancer in the world, that he was the son of Frank Sinatra, that people envious of his dancing ability were attempting to destroy his brains with little radios, and on and on. Delgado, facing starvation like so many other people in Guyaquil, thought his big problem was enemies with little radios. When he broke in through the back door of what was plainly a defunct souvenir shop, it wasn't a souvenir shop to him. To him, it was the headquarters of the Ecuadorian Ballet Folklorico, and he was now going to get his chance to prove that he really was the greatest dancer in the world. There are still plenty of hallucinators today, people who respond passionately to all sorts of things which aren't really going on. This could be a legacy from the Cancabonos, but people like that can't get hold of weapons now, and they're easy to swim away from. Even if they found a grenade or a machine gun or a knife or whatever left over from olden times, how could they ever make use of it with just their flippers and their mouths? When I was a child in Cohoes, my mother took me to see the circus in Albany one time, although we could not afford it, and Father did not approve of circuses. And there were trained seals and sea lions there who could balance balls on their noses and blow horns and clap their flippers on cue and so on. But they could never have loaded and cocked a machine gun, or pulled the pin on a hand grenade and thrown it any distance with any accuracy. As to how a person as crazy as Delgado got into the army in the first place, He looked all right and he acted all right when he talked to the recruiting officer, just as I did when I enlisted in the United States Marines. And Delgado was taken in during the previous summer, about the time Roy Hepburn died, for short-term service specifically associated with the nature cruise of the century. His unit was to be a spit and polish drill team, which was to strut its stuff before Mrs. Onassis and the rest of them. They were going to have assault rifles and steel helmets and all that, but surely not live ammunition. And Delgado was a wonderful marcher and polisher of brass buttons and shiner of shoes. But then Ecuador was convulsed by this economic crisis, and live ammunition was passed out to the soldiery. He was a harrowing example of quick evolution, but then so was any soldier. When I was through with Marine boot camp and I was sent to Vietnam and issued live ammunition, I bore almost no resemblance to the feckless animal I had been in civilian life. And I did worse things than Delgado. Now then, the store that Delgado broke into was a block of locked business establishments facing the El Dorado. The soldiers who had strung barbed wire around the hotel considered the stores as part of their barrier, so that when Delgado broke open the back door of one and then unlocked its front door just a hair and peeked out, he had made a hole in the barrier through which somebody else might pass. This breach was his contribution to the future of humankind, since very important people would pass through it in a very short while and reach the hotel. When Delgado looked out through the crack in the door, he saw two of his enemies. One of them was flourishing a little radio which could scramble his brains, or so he thought. This wasn't a radio. It was Mandarax, and the two supposed enemies were Zenji Hiraguchi and Andrew McIntosh. They were walking briskly along the inside of the barricade, as they were entitled to do since they were guests at the hotel. Hiraguchi was still boiling mad, and McIntosh was joshing him about taking life too seriously. They went right past the store where Delgado was lurking. So Delgado stepped out through the front door and shot them both in what he believed to be self-defense. So I don't have to put stars in front of the names of Zenji Hiraguchi and Andrew McIntosh anymore. I only did that to remind readers that they were the two of the 6 guests at the El Dorado who would be dead before the sun went down. They were dead now, and the sun was going down on a world where so many people believed 1,000,000 years ago that only the fit survived. Delgado, the survivor, disappeared into the store again and headed for the back door, where he expected to find more enemies to out-survive. But there were only 6 little brown beggar children out there, all girls. When this horrifying military freak leapt out at the little girls with all his killing equipment, they were too hungry and too resigned to death to run away. They opened their mouths instead and rolled their brown eyes and patted their stomachs and pointed down their gullets to show how hungry they were. Children all over the world were doing that back then, and not just in that one back alley in Ecuador. So Delgado just kept going, and he was never caught or punished or hospitalized or whatever. He was just one more soldier in a city teeming with soldiers, and nobody had gotten a good look at his face, which, in the shadow of his steel helmet, wasn't all that different from anybody else's face anyway. And like the great survivor he was, he would rape a woman the next day and become the father of one of the last 10 million children or so to be born on the South American mainland. After he was gone, the 6 little girls went into the shop seeking food or anything which might be traded for food. These were orphans from the Ecuadorian rainforest across the mountains to the east, from far, far away. Their parents had been killed by insecticides sprayed from the air, and a bush pilot had brought them to Guyaquil, where they had become children of the streets. These children were predominantly Indian, but had Negro ancestors as well, African slaves who had escaped into the rainforest long ago. These were Canca Bonos. They would grow to womanhood on Santa Rosalia, where, along with Hisako Hiraguchi, they would become the mothers of all modern humankind. Before they could get to Santa Rosalia, though, they would first have to reach the hotel, and the soldiers and the barricades would surely have stopped them from getting there if Private Geraldo Delgado had not opened up that pathway through the store. 28. These children would become 6 Eves to Captain von Kleist's Adam on Santa Rosalia, and they wouldn't have been in Guyaquil if it weren't for a young Ecuadorian bush pilot named Eduardo Jimenez. During the previous summer, on the day after Roy Hepburn was buried in fact, Jimenez was flying his own 4-passenger amphibious plane over the rainforest near the headwaters of the Tiputini River, which flowed into the Atlantic rather than Pacific Ocean. He had just delivered a French anthropologist and his survival equipment to a point downstream on the border of Peru where the Frenchmen planned to begin a search for the elusive cancabonos. Jimenez was headed next for Guyaquil, 500 kilometers away and across 2 high and rugged mountain barriers. In Guyaquil, he was to pick up 2 Argentinian millionaire sportsmen and take them to the landing field on the Galapagos Island of Baltra, where they had chartered a deep-sea fishing boat and crew. They would not be going after just any sort of fish either. They hoped to hook great white sharks, the same creatures who, 31 years later, would swallow Mary Hepburn and Captain von Kleist and Mandarax. Jimenez saw from the air these letters trampled in the mud of the riverbank. SOS. He landed on the water and then made his plane waddle ashore like a duck. He was greeted by an 80-year-old Roman Catholic priest from Ireland named Father Bernard Fitzgerald, who had lived with the Cancabonos for half a century. With him were the 6 little girls, the last of the Cancabonos. He and they had trampled the letters in the riverbank. Father Fitzgerald, incidentally, had a great-grandfather in common with John F. Kennedy, the first husband of Mrs. Onassis and the 35th President of the United States. If he had mated with an Indian, which he never did, everybody now alive might claim to be an Irish blue blood. Not that anybody today claims to be much of anything. After only about 9 months of life, people even forget who their mothers were. The girls had been at choir practice with Father Fitzgerald when everybody else in the tribe got sprayed. Some of the victims were still dying, so the old priest was going to stay with them. He wanted Jimenez, though, to take the girls someplace where somebody could look after them. So, in only 5 hours, these girls were flown from the Stone Age to the Electronics Age, from the freshwater swamps of the jungle to the brackish marshes of Guyaquil. They spoke only Cancabono, which only a few dying relatives in the jungle, and, as things would turn out, one dirty old white man in Guyaquil could understand. Jimenez was from Quito and had no place of his own where he could put up the girls in Guyaquil. He himself hired a room at the Hotel El Dorado, the same room which would later be occupied by Selena McIntosh and her dog. On the advice of police, he took the girls to an orphanage next door to the cathedral downtown, where nuns gladly accepted responsibility for them. There was still plenty of food for everyone. Jimenez then went to the hotel, and he told the story to the bartender there, who was Jesus Ortiz, the same man who would later disconnect all the telephones from the outside world. So Jimenez was one aviator who had quite a lot to do with the future of humanity. The other one was an American named Paul W. Tibbets. It was Tibbets who had dropped an atomic bomb on Hisako Hiraguchi's mother during World War II. People would probably be as furry as they are today, even if Tibbets hadn't dropped the bomb, but they certainly got furrier faster because of him. The orphanage put out a call for anybody who could speak Cancabono to serve as an interpreter. An old drunk and petty thief appeared, a pure white-bread man who, amazingly, was the grandfather of the lightest of the girls. When a youngster, he had gone prospecting for valuable minerals in the rainforest and had lived with the Cancabonos for 3 years. He had welcomed Father Fitzgerald to the tribe when the priest first arrived from Ireland. His name was Domingo Cazeda, and he was from excellent stock. His father had been head of the philosophy department of the Central University in Quito. If they were so inclined then, people today might claim to be descended from a long line of aristocratic Spanish intellectuals. When I was a little boy in Cohoes, I would detect nothing in the life of our little family about which I could be proud. My mother told me that I had the blood of French noblemen flowing in my veins. I would probably be living in a chateau on a vast estate over there, she said, if it hadn't been for the French Revolution. That was on her side of the family. I was also somehow related through her, she went on, to Carter Braxton, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. I should hold my head up high, she said, because of the blood flowing in my veins. I thought that was pretty good. So then I disturbed my father at his typewriter and asked him what my heritage was from his side of the family. I didn't know then what sperm was, and so wouldn't understand his answer for several years. "My boy," he said, "you are descended from a long line of determined, resourceful, microscopic tadpoles. Champions every one." Old Quezada, stinking like a battlefield, told the girls that they could trust only him, which was easy enough for them to believe, since he was the grandfather of one and the only person who could converse with them. They had to believe everything he said. They were without the means to be skeptical, since their new environment had nothing in common with the rainforest. They had many truths they were prepared to defend stubbornly and proudly, but none of them applied to anything they had so far seen in Guyaquil, except for one, a classically fatal belief in urban areas a million years ago. Relatives would never want to hurt them. Quezada, in fact, wished to expose them to terrible dangers as thieves and beggars, and, as soon as was remotely possible, as prostitutes. He would do this in order to feed his big brain's thirst for self-esteem and alcohol. He was at last going to be a man of wealth and importance. He took the girls on walks around the city, showing them, as far as the nuns at the orphanage were aware, the parks and the cathedral and the museums and so on. He was, in fact, teaching them what was hateful about tourists, and where to find them, and how to fool them, and where they were most likely to keep their valuables. And they played the game of spotting policemen before policemen spotted them, and memorizing good hiding places in the downtown area, should any enemy try to catch them. It was just pretend for the girls' first week in the city. But then Grandfather Domingo Quezada and the girls, as far as the nuns and the police were concerned, vanished entirely. That vile old ancestor of all humanity had moved the girls into an empty shed by the waterfront. A shed, as it happened, belonging to one of the two older cruise ships with which the Bahia de Darwin was meant to compete. The shed was empty because tourism had declined to the point where the old ship was out of business. At least the girls had each other, and during their early years on Santa Rosalia, until Mary Hepburn made them the gift of babies, that was what they were most grateful for. At least they had each other, and their own language, and their own religious beliefs and jokes and songs and so on. And that was what they would leave to their children on Santa Rosalia when they entered, one by one, the blue tunnel into the afterlife. The comforts of at least having each other, and the Cancabono language, and the Cancabono religion, and the Cancabono jokes and songs. During their bad old days in Guyaquil, old Quezada offered his stinking body for their experimentation as he taught them, as little as they were, the fundamental skills and attitudes of prostitutes. They were certainly in need of rescue long before the economic crisis. Yes, and one dusty window of the shed, which was their gruesome schoolhouse, framed the stern of the Bahia de Darwin right outside. Little did they know that that beautiful white ship would soon be their Noah's Ark. The girls finally ran away from the old man. They began to live in the streets, still begging and stealing. But, for reasons they could not understand, tourists became harder and harder to find, and, at last, there didn't seem to be anything anywhere to eat. They were truly hungry now, as they approached simply anyone, opening their mouths wide and rolling their eyes and pointing down their little throats to show how long it had been since they'd eaten. And late one afternoon, they were attracted by the sound of the crowd around the El Dorado. They found that the back door of a shuttered shop was open, and out came Geraldo Delgado, who had just shot Andrew McIntosh and Zenji Hiraguchi. So they went into the shop and out of the front door, They were inside the barrier set up by the soldiers, so there was nobody to stop them from entering the El Dorado, where they would throw themselves on the mercy of James Waite in the cocktail lounge. 29. Mary Hepburn was meanwhile murdering herself up in her room, lying on her bed with the polyurethane sheath of her Jackie dress wrapped around her head. The sheath was now all steamed up inside, and she hallucinated that she was a great land tortoise lying on its back in the hot and humid hold of a sailing ship of long ago. She pawed at the air in perfect futility, just as a land tortoise on its back would have done. As she had often told her students, sailing ships bound out across the Pacific used to stop off in the Galapagos Islands to capture defenseless tortoises who could live on their backs without food or water for months. They were so slow and tame and huge and plentiful, sailors would capsize them without fear of being bitten or clawed. They would drag them down to waiting longboats on the shore, using the animals' own useless suits of armor for sleds. They would store them on their backs in the dark, paying no further attention to them until it was time for them to be eaten. The beauty of the tortoises to the sailors was that they were fresh meat which did not have to be refrigerated or eaten right away. Every school year back in Ilium, Mary could count on some students being outraged that human beings should have treated such trusting creatures so cruelly. This gave her the opportunity to say that the natural order had dealt harshly with such tortoises long before there was such an animal as man. There used to be millions of them, lumbering over every temperate landmass of any size, she would say. But then some tiny animals evolved into rodents. These easily found and ate the eggs of the tortoises, all of the eggs. So, very quickly, that was that for the tortoises everywhere, except for those on a few islands which remained rodent-free. It was prophetic that Mary should imagine herself to be a land tortoise as she suffocated, since something very much like what had happened to most of the land tortoises so long ago was then beginning to happen to most of humankind. Some new creature, invisible to the naked eye, was eating up all the eggs in human ovaries, starting at the annual book fair at Frankfurt, Germany. Women at the fair were experiencing a slight fever, which came and went in a day or two, and sometimes blurry vision. After that, they would be just like Mary Hepburn. They couldn't have babies anymore. Nor would any way be discovered for stopping this disease. It would spread practically everywhere. The near extinction of mighty land tortoises by little rodents was certainly a David and Goliath story. Now here was another one. Yes, and Mary came close enough to death to see the blue tunnel into the afterlife. At that point, she rebelled against her big brain, which had brought her that far. She unwrapped the garment bag from her head and, instead of dying, she went downstairs, where she found James Waite feeding peanuts and olives and maraschino cherries and cocktail onions from behind the bar to the 6 Cancabono girls. This tableau of clumsy charity would remain imprinted in her brain for the rest of her life. She would believe ever after that he was an unselfish, compassionate, lovable human being. He was about to suffer a fatal heart attack, so nothing would ever happen to revise her high opinion of this loathsome man. On top of everything else, this man was a murderer. His murder had gone like this. He was a homosexual prostitute on the island of Manhattan, and a bloated plutocrat picked him up in a bar, asking him if he realized that the price tag was still on the hem of his lovely new blue velour shirt. This man had royal blood in his veins. This was Prince Richard of Croatia-Slavonia, a direct descendant of James I of England, and Emperor Frederick III of Germany, and Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, and King Louis XV of France. He ran an antique shop on Upper Madison Avenue, and he wasn't a homosexual. He wanted young Waite to strangle him with a silken sash from his dressing gown, and then to loosen the sash after having brought him as close as possible to death. Prince Richard had a wife and 2 children, who were on a skiing vacation in Switzerland, and his wife was young enough to be ovulating still. So young Waite may have prevented yet another carrier of those noble genes from being born. There was this, too. If Prince Richard hadn't been murdered, he and his wife might have been invited by Bobby King to take part in the nature cruise of the century. His widow would become a very successful designer of neckties, calling herself Princess Charlotte, although she was a commoner, the daughter of a Staten Island roofer, and not entitled to that rank or the use of his coat of arms. That crest nonetheless appeared on every tie she designed. The late Andrew McIntosh owned several Princess Charlotte ties. Waite spread-eagled this porky, chinless blue blood face up on a four-poster bed, which the prince said had belonged to Eleanor of Palatinate Neuburg, the mother of King Joseph I of Hungary. Waite tied him to the thick posts with nylon ropes already cut to length. These had been stored in a secret drawer under the flounce at the foot of the bed. This was an old drawer, and had at one time concealed secrets of the sex life of Eleanor of Palatinate Neuburg.
"Tie me nice and tight, so I can't get away,"
Prince Richard told young Waite.
"But don't cut off the circulation. I would hate to get gangrene."
His big brain had him doing this at least once a month for the past 3 years, hiring strangers to tie him up and strangle him just a little bit. What a survival scheme! Prince Richard of Croatia-Slavonia, possibly with the ghosts of his progenitors looking on, instructed young James Waite to strangle him to the point where he lost consciousness. Then Waite, whom he knew only as Jimmy, was to count slowly to 20 in this manner.
1001, 1002,
and so on. Possibly with King James and Emperor Frederick and Emperor Franz Joseph and King Louis looking on, the prince, one of several claimants to the throne of Yugoslavia, warned Jimmy not to touch any part of his body or clothing save for the sash around his neck. He would experience orgasm, but Jimmy was not to attempt to enhance that event with his mouth or hands.
"I am not a homosexual,"
he said,
"and I've hired you as a sort of valet, not a prostitute. This may be hard for you to believe, Jimmy," he went on, "if you lead the kind of life I think you lead, but this is a spiritual experience for me, so keep it spiritual, otherwise no $100 tip. Do I make myself clear? I am an unusual man."
He didn't tell Waite about it, but his big brain put on quite a movie for him while he was unconscious. It showed him one end of a writhing piece of blue tubing, about 5 meters in diameter, big enough to drive a truck through, and lit up inside like the funnel of a tornado. It did not roar like a tornado, however. Instead, unearthly music, as though from a glass harmonica, came from the far end, which appeared to be about 50 meters away. Depending on how the tube twisted, Prince Richard could catch glimpses of the opening in the far end, a golden dot and hints of greenery. This, of course, was the tunnel into the afterlife. So Waite put a small rubber ball into the mouth of this would-be liberator of the Yugoslavs, as he had been told to do, and sealed the mouth with a pre-cut piece of adhesive tape, which had been stuck to a bedpost. Then he strangled the prince, cutting off the blood supply to his big brain and the air supply to his lungs. Instead of counting slowly to 20 after the prince lost consciousness and had his orgasm and saw the writhing tube, he counted slowly to 300 instead. That was 5 minutes. It was Waite's big brain's idea. It wasn't anything he himself had particularly wanted to do. If he had ever been brought to trial for the murder or the manslaughter or whatever the government chose to call this crime, he would probably have pleaded temporary insanity. He would have claimed that his big brain simply wasn't working right at the time. There wasn't a person alive a million years ago who didn't know what that was like. Apologies for momentary brain failures were the staple of everybody's conversations. "Whoops! Excuse me, I hope you're not hurt. I can't believe I did that. It happened so fast I didn't have time to think. I have insurance against this kind of thing. And how can I ever forgive myself? And I didn't know it was loaded." And on and on. There were beads and dollops of human sperm on the prince's crested satin sheets, full of royal tadpoles racing each other to nowhere, as young Waite let himself out of the triple apartment on Sutton Place. He hadn't stolen anything, and he hadn't left any fingerprints. The doorman of the building, who had seen him coming and going, was able to tell the police very little about his appearance, save that he was young and white and slender, and wore a blue velour shirt from which the price tag had not been removed. And there was something prophetic, too, in those millions of royal tadpoles on a satin sheet, with no place meaningful to go. The whole world, as far as human sperm was concerned, with the exception of the Galapagos Islands, was about to become like that satin sheet. Dare I add this? In the nick of time. 30. I will now put a star in front of the name of James Waite, indicating that, after Siegfried von Kleist, he will be the next to die. Siegfried would go into the Blue Tunnel first, in about an hour and a half, and Waite would follow in about 14 hours, having first married Mary Hepburn on the sun deck of the Bahia de Darwin when it was well at sea. Quoth Mandarax so long ago, "All's well that ends well." John Haywood, 1497 to 1580? This was surely the case with the life of James Waite. He had come into this world as a child of the devil, supposedly, and beatings had begun almost immediately. But here he was so close to the end now, astonished by the joy of feeding the Cancabono girls. They were so grateful, and helping them was such an easy thing to do, since the bar was stocked with snacks and garnishes and condiments. The opportunity to be charitable had simply never presented itself before, but here it was now, and he was loving it. To these children, Waite was life itself. And then the widow Hepburn appeared, as he had been hoping she would all afternoon. Nor did he have to win her trust. She liked him immediately because he was feeding the children, and she said to him, because she had seen so many hungry children on her way to the hotel from Guyaquil International Airport the previous afternoon, "Oh, good for you! Good for you!" She assumed then, and would never believe differently, that this man had seen the children outside and had invited them in so he could feed them. "Why can't I be like you?" Mary went on. "Here I've been upstairs, doing nothing but feeling sorry for myself, when I should have been down here like you, sharing what we have with all those poor children out there. You make me so ashamed, but my brains just haven't been working right lately. Sometimes I could just kill my brains." She spoke to the children in English, a language they would never understand. "Does that taste good?" she said, and "Where are your mommies and daddies?" and that sort of thing. The little girls would never learn English, since Cancabono would from the first be the language of the majority on Santa Rosalia. In a century and a half, it would be the language of the majority of humankind. 42 years after that, Cancabono would be the only language of humankind. There was no urgency about Mary's getting the girls better things to eat. A diet of peanuts and oranges, of which there were plenty behind the bar, was ideal. The girls spit out whatever wasn't good for them, the cherries and the green olives and the little onions. They needed no help with eating. So Mary and Waite were free to simply watch and chat and get to know each other. Waite said that he thought people were put on Earth to help each other, and that was why he was feeding the children. He said that children were the future of the world, and so the planet's greatest natural resource. "Permit me to introduce myself," he said. "I am Willard Fleming of Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan." Mary said who and what she was, an ex-teacher and a widow. He said how much he admired teachers and how important they had been to him when he was young. "If it hadn't been for teachers in high school," he said, "I never would have gone to MIT. I probably wouldn't have gone to college at all. Probably would have just been an automobile mechanic like my father." "So what did you become?" she said. "Less than nothing since my wife died of cancer," he said. "Oh," she said, "I'm so sorry." "Well, it's not your fault, is it?" he said. "No," she said. "Before that," he said, "I was a windmill engineer. I had this crazy idea that there was all this clean, free energy around. Does that sound crazy to you?" "It's a beautiful idea," she said. "It was something my husband and I talked about." "The power and light companies hated me," he said, "and the oil barons and the coal barons and the Atomic Energy Trust." I should think they would, she said. They can stop worrying about me now, he said. I closed up shop after my wife died, and I've been roaming the world ever since. I don't even know what I'm looking for. I very much doubt if there's anything worth finding. I'm just sure of one thing. I can never love again. You have so much to give the world, she said. If I ever did love again, he said, it wouldn't be with the sort of silly, pretty little ball of fluff so many men seem to want today. I couldn't stand it. I wouldn't think so, she said. I've been spoiled, he said. I expect you deserved it, she said. And I ask myself, what good is money now? He said. I'm sure your husband was as good a husband as my wife was a wife. He really was a very good man, she said. A perfectly wonderful man. So you're certainly asking the same question. What good is money to a person all alone? He said. Suppose you have $1 million. Oh, Lord, she said. I don't have anything like that. All right, 100,000 then. That's a little more like it, she said. It's just trash now, right? He said. What happiness can it buy? A certain amount of creature comfort anyway, she said. You've got a nice house, I imagine, he said. Quite nice, she said. And a car, and maybe 2 or 3 cars and all that, he said. 1 car, she said. A Mercedes, I'll bet, he said. A Jeep, she said. And you've probably got stocks and bonds, just like I do, he said. Roy's company had a stock bonus plan, she said. Oh, sure, he said. And an insurance plan, and a retirement plan, and all the rest of the middle-class dream of security. We both worked, she said. We both contributed. I wouldn't have a wife who didn't work, he said. My wife worked for the phone company. After she died, the death benefits, after they were all added up, turned out to be quite a bit, but they just wanted to make me cry. They were just more reminders of how empty my life had become. And her little jewel box with all the rings and pins and necklaces I'd given her over the years, and no children to pass it on to. We didn't have children either, she said. It seems we have a lot in common, he said. So, who will you leave your jewelry to? Oh, there isn't much, she said. I guess the only valuable piece is a string of pearls Roy's mother left me. It has a diamond clasp. There are so few times I wear jewelry. I'd almost forgotten those pearls until this very moment. I certainly hope they're insured, he said. 31. How people used to talk and talk back then. Everybody was going blah, blah, blah all day long. Some of them would even do it in their sleep. My father used to blather in his sleep a lot, especially after Mother walked out on us. I would be sleeping on the couch, and it would be in the middle of the night, and there wouldn't be anybody else in the house but us, and I would hear him going blah, blah, blah in the bedroom. It would be quiet for a little while, and then he would go blah, blah, blah again. And sometimes when I was in the Marines, or later in Sweden, somebody would wake me up to tell me to stop talking in my sleep. I would have no recollection of what I might have said. I would have to ask what I had been talking about, and it was always news to me. What could most of that blah blah blahing have been, both night and day, but the spilling of useless, uncalled-for signals from our preposterously huge and active brains? There was no shutting them down. Whether we had anything for them to do or not, they ran all the time. And were they ever loud? Oh God, were they ever loud! When I was still alive, there were these portable radios and tape players some young people carried with them wherever they went in cities in the United States, playing music at a volume capable of drowning out a thunderstorm. These were called ghetto blasters. It wasn't enough 1,000,000 years ago that we already had ghetto blasters inside our heads. Even at this late date, I am still full of rage at a natural order which would have permitted the evolution of something as distracting and irrelevant and disruptive as those great big brains of 1,000,000 years ago. If they had told the truth, then I could see some point in everybody's having one. But these things lied all the time. Look at how James Waite was lying to Mary Hepburn. And now Siegfried von Kleist returned to the cocktail lounge, having witnessed the shooting of Zenji Hiraguchi and Andrew McIntosh. If his big brain had been a truth machine, he might have given Mary and Waite information to which they were surely entitled, and which might have been very useful to them in case they wished to survive. That he was in the first stages of a mental crack-up, that 2 hotel guests had just been shot, that the crowd outside couldn't be held back much longer, that the hotel was out of touch with the rest of the world, and so on. But no. He maintained a placid exterior. He did not wish his remaining 4 guests to panic. As a result, they would never find out what became of Zenji Hiraguchi and Andrew McIntosh. For that matter, they would never hear the news, which would be announced in about an hour, that Peru had declared war on Ecuador, and neither would the captain. When Peruvian rockets hit targets in the Guyaquil area, they would believe the captain when he said what his big brain honestly believed to be the truth. Not that it felt any compunction to tell the truth, that they were being showered by meteorites. As long as there was anybody on Santa Rosalia curious as to why his or her ancestors had come there, and that sort of curiosity would finally peter out only after about 3,000 years, that was the story. They were driven off the mainland by a shower of meteorites. Quoth Mandarax, "Happy is the nation without a history." Cesare Bonasaria, Marquise de Beccaria, 1738 to 1794. So, in a perfectly calm tone of voice, Siegfried, the captain's brother, asked Waite to go upstairs and to ask Selina McIntosh and Hisako Hiraguchi to come down and to help them with their luggage. "Be careful not to alarm them," he said. "Let them know that everything is perfectly all right. Just to be safe, I am going to take you all out to the airport." Guayaquil International Airport, incidentally, would be the first target to be devastated by Peruvian rocketry. He handed Mandarax to Waite so that Waite would be able to communicate with Hisako. He had recovered the instrument from beside the body of Zenji. Both bodies had been moved out of sight into the burglarized souvenir shop. Siegfried himself had covered them with souvenir bedspreads, which bore the same portrait of Charles Darwin which hung behind the bar. So Siegfried von Kleist shepherded Mary Hepburn and Hisako Hiraguchi and James Waite and Selina McIntosh and Kazak out to a gaily decorated bus parked in front of the hotel. This bus was to have carried musicians and dancers out to the airport to regale the celebrities from New York. The 6 Cancabono girls came right along with them, and I have put a star in front of the dog's name, because she would soon be killed and eaten by those children. It was no time to be a dog. Selina wanted to know where her father was, and Hisako wanted to know where her husband was. Siegfried said that they had gone ahead to the airport. His plan was to somehow get them on a plane, whether a commercial flight or a charter flight or a military flight, which would get them safely out of Ecuador. The truth about Andrew McIntosh and Zenji Hiraguchi would be the last thing they heard from him before the plane took off, at which time they might still survive, no matter how frenzied with grief they became. As a sop to Mary, he agreed to take the 6 girls along. He could make no sense of their language even with the help of Mandarax. The best Mandarax could do was to identify 1 word in 20 maybe as being closely related to Quechuan, the lingua franca of the Incan Empire. Here and there, Mandarax thought it might have heard a little Arabic too, the lingua franca of the African slave trade so long ago. Now, there is a big brain idea I haven't heard much about lately. Human slavery. How could you ever hold somebody in bondage with nothing but your flippers and your mouth?